This is ANTIC, the Atari 8-bit podcast.
Huge room full of 1 megahertz but not 1.1 megahertz devices. So that's what they put in the peripherals was 6507 that they had surplus lying around. The first chips came into the lab, and I was plugging in the CTIA, the first one, completely untested, and I dropped it and it broke in half.
This is an interview episode of ANTIC, the Atari 8-bit podcast. I'm Kevin Savitz. Steve Smith was an engineering technician at Atari from 1977 until 1979, where he worked on the development of the Atari 400 and 800 computers. He was one of the technicians who designed the ANTIC and CTIA chips. In this interview, we discuss Liza Loop, whom I previously interviewed. This interview took place on February 9th, 2016. Where do we start? Tell me the story before you got hired by Atari, how you got interested in computers, how you were a geek. Kind of set me up.
So Atari was my first job out of college.
Mm-hmm.
So in my last quarter in college, did the interviewing thing, and Craig Hansen was the guy from Atari that interviewed me, and I had job offers from what became Loral later and Atari and National, and I was talking with Craig about it. He says, well, Loral may be okay. I mean, that sounds like an interesting job, but whatever you do, don't go to National. And I thought, a guy who could be that straightforward and honest, besides, Atari sounded like fun, so that's how I got into Atari.
All right. What was National?
National Semiconductor?
Oh, okay, right, sure. Just too big and corporate and businessy compared to Atari?
Well, no, actually, it's the people that I know that went there were very sorry they went there. It was not a nice place to work. So,
right. So you were hired at Atari as what? What was your first job there?
So the first job I had there, the job that I had there was a technician. What we did, it's the Wayback Machine. There was no logic simulator that was available in '77 when I went to Atari. So what we did was the guys would draw up the logic diagrams, and this is like pen and paper kind of drawings. It was actually, plastic lead on Mylar, but they would draw up what they wanted, the transistor level, gate level drawings of whatever the chip was going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I would take their drawings and translate them to components I could buy off the shelf, 2-input NAND gates and NOR gates and flip-flops, etc. And we would actually build it up. So the Atari 800, the 3 chips that were the LSI chips, they were 1,500 different small-scale integration or SSI parts. And we used a low-power Schottky TTL for it, built them up, and so I did the CTIA with George McLeod. He was the logic designer, the chip designer, and I did the breadboard for it. And Pokey was done by somebody else whose name escapes me at this point. And the 2 guys did the ANTIC, Joe DeCure and Francois Michel. And Jim Luby was the technician who translated it and then had the boards built up. So when they came back from Adam Matofian, who was the guy who had a service for wire wrapping boards, literally wiring up all these small, all these little chips to emulate the chips we were building. They came back with all blue wires. So when we made changes, we found bugs and changed them. We used red wire so you could tell what was new and what was old. And George did a great job with the CTIA. There wasn't much red in it, but between Joe and Francis Michelle, there was a couple of boards that were all red. Poor Jim was hard pressed to keep up with it. I think they all but started over at one point.
Wow.
But yeah, so that was the second job that I did at Atari. The first job that I did was what we called a video frog. It was a pseudo-programmable game, essentially a game chip, like Pong, the original Atari video game. But it was a standard platform, and it was going to be a custom chip for each game. It was just going to be too expensive for the market. The 2600 came out and was such a big hit because it was programmable. The software was a lot cheaper to put into a cartridge than a whole game chip. So that project, the first project for me out of college, we got it up and running, and then they canceled the project.
Wow. You said it was called Video Frog?
Well, that's what we called it inside.
Sure.
It was never marketed, so I don't know what they would have called it.
But this should have, this was supposed to be a follow-up to the 2600, but you putting more of the software and hardware rather than...
It was all hardware. It was just the gates themselves. It was like the original Pong game,
right?
Which was just a custom chip that played that game and didn't know anything else.
Wow.
And the one game that I worked on there was called Sandy. It was a driving game, and it was pretty lame. It would not have sold well. But as I said, they canceled it before it came out, so it was not a flop. It never saw the light of day.
Wow. So what had you studied? What had you studied in college?
Oh, I just double E.
All right. So your first job out of college, you had Atari, and then you're not there very long. It sounds like before they're just like, oh, you're going to help design this computer now.
Well, yeah. So when they realized that the Video Frog was not going to make anybody any money, wasn't going to sell anything. So as they were winding it down, Jay Miner happened into the lab and asked me if I wanted to go work on Colleen, which was the Atari 800. And I said, sounds good to me. Didn't have any idea what they were working on or what it was going to be. But so I moved, within the company from one group to another. And the group I was moving from was just simply folded up tent. It was gone. So that's how I got into the Atari 800. And, in hindsight, there were a lot of things, in marketing that we did wrong with it. Probably chief among them holding the users in real contempt. It was not, how do we make it better for the user? It was like, users. So...
Really? Why was it like that? I'm trying to think.
It was. Remember the time. This was, in the late 70s when people that used home computers were mostly, geeks, and you could give them a board that would only stay running for 20 minutes, and they were really happy that it ran for 20 minutes. Oh my God, that's great. So, it was just such a different time and a different mindset. We got better. But things that the Atari 800 did really well. It had the bones of a word processor in ROM, every unit. And, if you pull the cartridge out and fire it up, it's there. It's, a little note taker.
Right, the memo pad
If they had understood how important that would have been, how important that was to be, word processing on little machines that everybody could do, it would not have taken much to really make that a great feature of that product. So that's what I mean by missing the marketing mark. Little things like deciding that all the floppies had to be pre-formatted, that they wouldn't support formatting blank floppies. And again, that was to try and market floppies as an item, and it sounded good at the time, but in retrospect, it was a huge mistake.
I'm not sure I'm following you there, because with the Atari DOS, you can format a floppy disk and then it's formatted. Was that not originally
not the first?
Really?
That was not originally part of the machine. No, that came later.
What? So you needed to buy like Atari branded formatted discs?
Yep.
That's ridiculous.
So yeah, of course it's ridiculous, and that's what I mean by missing the market. Missing the marketing piece. The Atari floppy, when it came out, used a 6507 running at 500 kilohertz, and so 2600 used that same 6507, and it was certified by the chip manufacturer to run at 1 megahertz, but Atari ran them at color clock over 3, which is 1.1 and some change. So Atari actually speed binned them. They tested every part to make sure it would run fast enough, and they had a huge room full of 1 megahertz but not 1.1 megahertz devices. So that's what they put in the peripherals was a 6507 that they had surplus lying around.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a brilliant idea. It meant that the floppy, there was no good reason not to have, all of the peripherals were smart peripherals initially. They were coming off of the serial bus line, and so they could have done a lot with that right off the get-go they didn't do. The printer it should have been a full 8 by 10 printer, and it wasn't. It was a little stream printer, a little half-column printer.
Mm-hmm.
So, missing where home computing was going to be was what really happened. Great graphics, marvelous gameplay. They knocked that out of the park. It was a great machine for that.
There was a quote on, speaking of gameplay, on Doug Neubauer's website on how he was testing Star Raiders, and you saw a feature of it, and you said it was really lame, and so he changed it.
Well, Doug was he did Pokey, and then didn't know what to do with himself, so he wrote Star Raiders, and he was using some of the player graphics. And just because I could, I shot the mothership, and he about fell over. Yes, it exploded, but it was not a gameplay that he expected anybody to do. So he changed the game to incorporate.
And this was still running on wire wrap proto Atari at this point?
The first time I saw it, it was running on the wire wrap boards. We did 4 systems that were wire wrapped, the 1500 ICs, plus a separate board that had the 6502 on it. And those 4 were used for the operating system development and all the game development and the diagnostics that Joe and others wrote just to check out and make sure that the CTIA and ANTIC were working well together. From today's standards, it's a pretty simple set of chips, but at the time it was complex, and the overall architecture was interesting, innovative, and I learned a tremendous amount. As I said, it was my first job out of college, so I was busy crawling all over the designs because that was my job, but it was a tremendous learning time for me as well.
So you worked on both the ANTIC and the CTIA, is that right?
No, I just worked on the CTIA and helped a little on ANTIC, and of course the keeping the machines running was a full-time job as well.
So what was involved with that? I mean, you have this this 1,500 part machine. It goes out of business, and then what do you do?
Well, you've got to figure out what went wrong, which chip and what area. By the time that we'd actually built up and troubleshot and debugged 4 different systems, I knew the CTA very well, the logic on it, as well as George did, the guy who designed it. So when it went down, it was pretty easy to figure out, what had happened and where the fault had to be and to fix it. It was also easy to start blaming the software, but that's a different story.
All right. So then what? What happens next? You're working on the chips, and then
when January '79, we took it to Consumer Electronics Show, and that was my first trade show. And there are a couple of pictures I've got laying around of me behind the counter demonstrating the unit. Larry Kaplan ran the afternoon behind the counter, and I did the mornings. Poor Larry, we shared a hotel room, and at that time I snored terribly, so he couldn't actually sleep when I was in the room. So he stayed up gambling most of the night and slept while I was behind the counter, and then after lunch, 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he came in and did the afternoon. He was much better at it than I was, but couldn't be there the whole day. But the picture, it's actually on my Facebook page. If you look the pictures up. I'll
have to try to find it. All right, I'll look for that. All right, so you went to the CES and didn't let other people sleep. And tell me something about the show. Were people wild? Was it amazing?
It was also, everything was new. I was like a baby. Just everything was new and different and interesting. And I actually danced with my first wife that first time ever at
Liza?
the CES show. Yeah.
Wow.
If you've talked to her, I'm sure she'll tell you about.
I talked to her.
Rebecca's barge.
I talked to her about a year ago, but I'd like to hear your perspective on everything. I understand you and she were married by Jay Miner.
Yes, in 1981. Jay was a Universal Life Church minister, and after we got rolling and things were running on Colleen, on the project, it was Jay and I became pretty good friends. One of my favorite stories, we had the machine mostly together. I think there were so as the chips came back from wafer fab and were tested out, we replaced that rack of boards. I think it was 4 for ANTIC and 3 for each of the CTIA and Pokey. We replaced those with the actual LSI. And so it was mostly an LSI demonstration we were doing, but the retailers were in, JCPenney and Sears and a couple of other guys, and not a lot of the guys were comfortable trying to demo, the fragile software and playing the games and what we had running at the time. So I ended up doing that demo. And as I was doing the demo, this curly-haired, not very tall, but huge presence kind of person kept standing in front of me and interrupting me. But, as I said, I was new to everything at the time, so I just stood back and filled in, corrected a couple of major errors. And after the demo was over, I was back talking with Jay in his office, and I said, Jay, who's that curly-haired loudmouth that kept interrupting me? And just about that time, that same character walked in the door, and Jay said, Steve, I'd like you to meet Nolan.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
So that's when I met Nolan Bushnell. The other thing is, as I said, when the chips came back, they were only mostly processed. The top side of chips at that time and still today is a protected layer. We call it passivation, and it's either polyamide or at that time it was all silicon dioxide, just glass. And so these chips didn't have that top layer on them, so we could actually probe them, which turned out to be important in a couple of cases. But chips that don't have that top side passivation don't last very long. We went to the CES with the CTIA unpassivated. So those machines weren't expected to last more than a couple of months. But the first chips came into the lab, and I was plugging in the CTIA, the first one, completely untested, and I dropped it, and it broke in half.
No.
The lab was absolutely full of people and anticipation, and I just simply wasn't up to it. So anyway, the second one plugged in, and almost all of it was working, and because the chips were untested, random defects could happen anywhere, so you had to keep looking around and see if you've got each part of the design working, even if you don't have it working in all chips, and then go through and figure out which ones are actually all working. But dropping the first one, having it break in half was
it's not an auspicious start for sure.
Yeah. It turned out not to be too bad. We also at that time had figured out that the player graphics were inverted. Instead of you put a one where you want the player graphics on, it was inverted. So the guys had to rewrite the programs to program the player not instead of the player. That didn't take long, but we were able to demo the units with that.
So you just changed the software rather than changing the hardware?
Yeah. In the end, the hardware was changed, but initially, to get the demos going, and CTIA was only one of the three chips, so
right.
We had to look at all of them.
Oh,
so while we were off making that change, we did the workaround. When the ANTIC came back, there was a bug. It was a layout problem, and several gates were shorted together because so chips are just polygons, and if you leave off a couple of vertices, a little polygon kind of becomes larger. It expands to the next set of vertices. ANTIC had one of those kind of bugs, so several gates shorted together. And Joe and the team were putting down probes right onto the device itself and wiring around the gates to see if there were any other bugs, if they kind of repaired that area using the same kind of gates that we built up the racks to begin with. And they were able to prove that the rest of the ANTIC was okay, just that one area. Now, of course, we use software to check that the logic is what we designed. The layout matches the logic design, but then it was done by hand. Jay and I went through a couple of the chips. Jay was reading the MOS, actually looking at each polygon and making sure, yes, that set of polygons makes a transistor, and it's, and I was reading the logic, and we were describing it back to each other and checked the entire chip. It was a day and night process for a couple of weeks to get through. We did the CTIA and then the ANTIC. There were other groups, everybody doing 2 chips, but at least 2 groups doing the logic versus layout check on each device. And we still managed to miss one on the ANTIC. But that was Jay's fault, not mine. And I can say that he's safely out of earshot now.
Right. Yeah. All right. So you worked on it, and then at some point you were declared it done, I guess. And what happened?
Yeah, and then there was the huge exodus. Jay went off to work at a company called Custom MOS, and I ended up reporting to the guy who was running the software group, and I can't remember his name. But he says, "Well, do you have enough to keep yourself busy for like 6 weeks?" And I said, "Yeah, no problem." So just puttering around the lab until Jay called and said, "Hey, why don't you come over here and do the same thing you were doing over there?" And I had begun to see the marketing mistakes that had been made. And, I had worked with the Apple II. I should tell you about the Apple II recordings.
Please
remember the marketing collateral. We'll go into that. Anyway, when I went over and interviewed, it turns out that, of course, Jay had been around the Valley for a long time, and he was going to work for an old buddy of his, Bert Braddock, at Custom MOS, which was later renamed Zymos. And I spent 10 years there doing 5 different jobs. First, doing breadboarding, but then, of course, logic simulators sprung into being, and I ran their LSI test department and did the first commercially successful motherboard chipset, which Intel marketed under their labels. So, but that was later. The marketing collaterals. So before we had the Atari 800 actually running, they wanted a videotape. And we didn't have, I couldn't actually record the footage that they wanted from the Atari 800. It wasn't actually running. They wanted it on a 3/4-inch Sony U-matic drive. Mm-hmm. So I was going to take it off of the screen from an Apple II, which we had laying around in the lab. And the Apple II's video is not RS-170. It's not exactly the same timing. It's certainly close enough for the televisions of the day, but you couldn't broadcast it. It's not timing correct. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the U-matic drive wouldn't record it. So one of the nice things that Wozniak did was he published the Red Book, which was the schematics for the Apple II. which we also had in the lab. And the Red Book also had the listing of the ROMs. So marvelous set of documentation. So I was able to increase the sync pulse height, just lowering resistor value until the sync pulse was so high that the U-matic tape deck, the Sony 3/4 inch tape deck, would record it anyway.
Nice.
And so, I got all the screenshots they wanted, and the MS Basic was the same that Apple used and Atari ended up with. But that recording was still, the Sony was able to capture it, but it was still the same timing of the Apple II. So when they went to try and do the editing, the editor wouldn't touch it. The automatic editor wouldn't record it. They had to do all of the cuts manually. So they were not very pleased. The house that had contracted to do to cut that final demo together, and that demo only lasted until just before the January '79 CES. At the CES, we had everything running, and so we could record it directly off of our own machine, and there wasn't an issue. But if you ever get a hold of that old recording, you can tell all the text has that Apple sparkly look to it because of the way they did color.
Yeah. Wow. I don't think that tape is out there in the world. I'm not sure. I've never seen it.
I haven't seen it in a lot of years. I don't know. There may not be a copy left. So David Yeardrum, who actually introduced Liza to Atari and ultimately to me, was the guy who was supposed to work with Microsoft, who turned out at the time was only Bill Gates, to get BASIC running on the 800.
Okay.
It was Microsoft BASIC that David was working with. And they had, for security reasons, they had encrypted it. And they gave him a decrypting tool and the file, and it didn't decrypt properly. And David had to go through and figure out what mistake they had made. Fortunately, it was not rocket science. It wasn't like triple DES encryption. So he was able to figure out what they did wrong and decode it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But when he called, Bill's response was, "Well, it worked before we encoded it. It's your problem."
Great.
Which is, it took David a 3 days to figure out what he needed to do to recover it. And of course, obviously, it was up and running before CES. Be careful where you buy your software.
Right. Yikes. So you mentioned when you're working with Jay later on, is that you worked on the Amiga with him as well, right?
No. That was an unfortunate career move that was made for me. As I said, Bert and Jay go way back at that time. And Jay said, "Look, I'm going to go off and start Moore's Computers," which became Amiga. And Bert, president of the company, says, "You can't take Steve with you. If you do, it'll cost you your stock." So I didn't end up going to Amiga.
Wow.
Yeah. And of course, I didn't hear that. I didn't hear that story until 10 years later.
Wow. Why were you forbidden from joining him?
It was only a tiny little company at that point. Anybody leaving would have been quite a hurt. I'm not anything special in that, but it was just two people leaving was too much. So
Right. So tell me about how long were you at Atari?
about 18 months.
Okay. And have we talked about we talked about your hiring, talked about the frog thing and working on the chips and CES. Anything else happened before your time there ended?
Oh, just a couple of nights of wonderful hot tub down at the bottom of 472 Baragas. Last time I went by that building, it was actually it didn't look like the company that was in it would be using a hot tub. I don't know.
Not a hot tub kind of firm.
No.
Was it? So I've heard of stories here and there about just like debauchery at Atari and parties in the hot tub and people just like, cocaine and craziness and, what can you confirm or deny?
Well, I never saw any cocaine when I was there. I saw a lot of alcohol. And fortunately, I did my training early, so I can. After working at Atari, I could drink with the best of them. And there was a lot of oxygen use, which I found kind of fun. And some people using dope, but I never saw any cocaine floating around. The drunken debauchery in the hot tub, oh yeah. But that was a long time ago. I'm sure the statute of limitations is run.
Sure. All right, so I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about you and Liza, if that's okay. You said that you had your first dance with her, and just kind of tell me. I mean, the inter-Atari relationships are always interesting.
Well, Liza was. The first time I met her, I always got to work, early in the morning, at least by 11, absolutely by 11:30, because I went to lunch at 11:30, and I never was late to lunch. But I was stumbling towards the coffee machine. Couldn't have been. It was probably 11 in the morning for my first cup of coffee, and there was a person in my way. And fortunately, I identified that there was a person in the way and didn't run them over. I stopped and I said, hello. Stopped for a next line. I said something like, what do you do here? And Liza retorted, well, what do you think I do here? That was our first exchange. Fortunately, I did get to the coffee machine shortly after that. And Liza was, she was a single parent with two very little kids, trying to David had gotten her down into the valley. She ended up writing the manual for that first Atari 800, all of the user materials. And as much, guidance as could be given, she was giving marketing guidance to Wade, and I think that mostly fell on deaf ears, but we had a good time. Anyway, after I left Atari, Liza and I were just friends, and that stayed that way for about another year and a half, probably 2 years, until we were up on Jay's boat one weekend, and after I drove her back to her house, I think it was Memorial weekend. No, Labor Day weekend. End of the summer. I just moved in. We were married that next May 1st.
Wow. Nice.
So we never actually dated.
Nice. I would like to hear a story about Jay Miner, since he can't tell me any stories.
Oh, Jay was an interesting guy. A couple of things that actually happened after Atari. We did at Zymos, which was what Custom MOS became, because Custom MOS was a dumb name for a company. That's funny because, of course, Zymos is also a dumb name.
Yes.
Sorry. But one of the early investor was a pacemaker company, a medical supply company out of Texas. And they needed a processor for the guts of their pacemaker. The company name was Intermedics, and they were out of Freeport, Texas. And Jay and a consultant, designed up that processor, and of course I did the wire wrap board and proved it out. And we, along the way, there was a lot of innovation. And Jay and the consultant, whose name escapes me at this point, I can see his face. But anyway, they filed several patents. And years later, the patent still hadn't issued, but there was an interference. A Belgian patent had come in. The patent office requires that you file patents in English. We don't in this country have an official language, but the PTO does require that they be filed in English. And the interfering patent was filed in I guess it was Flemish. Anyway, Intermedics, who the patents favored, the patents were assigned to Intermedics, was defending the patents, and they sent the lawyers, guns, and money. Well, anyway, the lawyers out to talk to Jay and me about, all of the things that you need to defend a patent. In priority, you have to conceive the idea, and you have to reduce it to practice, and you have to work diligently on it. And our documentation wasn't so very strong at the time. Day by day, did I keep a log of what I was doing? Of course not. I was just working.
Right.
But we did bill Intermedics, and they did keep the bills. So the working diligently on it was actually pretty well documented. The conception and reduction to practice, we had actually built it up. As I said, the SSI gates, that one, I don't remember the chip count, but it was a pretty sizable board. We still had the schematics, and the lawyers were, and Jay and I were sitting in Jay's hot tub out under the stars one beautiful night, and they were talking about one particular patent, and Jay and I were talking back and forth about the logic. As I've said, when you end up building the board up and debugging it, you get incredibly familiar with the logic, much more intimate than anybody does now in design. So the two of us were talking about the chip and it's working from memory, and the lawyers from our side were just eating it up. It's like, oh my God, we don't need documentation. It's sitting right here. So after those interviews, Intermedic hired lawyers went back, and the other side withdrew their patent app.
Wow.
Dave had hoped that enough time had gone by that we wouldn't be able to defend it, but we were ready.
Wow.
But the notion that you would sit around in the hot tub discussing the guts of the chip and the basic concepts behind it was it's only California. So many stories about Jay. He used to have a very large trawler. Well, before that, the Flying Cloud, which was a Great Lakes boat. Carver was the brand. And we would take it out up on the Delta, exploring all the little nooks and crannies. It was like a floating hotel.
Wow.
It was fun. Lots of weekends floating around the Delta. That was what Jay wanted most, was the piloting a big boat around with lots of people to help him enjoy. It was kind of nice. That's one of the reasons Liza and the boys and I ended up on the Delta with Jay many, many times.
Nice.
Part of the reason that he had to be the one to tie the knot for us was he was pretty instrumental in making it happen to begin with. So one last story about Jay before I've got to get back to my evening. But well, it's actually two stories, but they happened at the same time. As I said, Jay went off to found Amiga from Zymos, but while he was there, he looked at me and he said, "So, how long would you spend in jail for $1 million?" And I said, "Jay, do you feel like you're in jail?" And he looked at me and he says, "Well," it was as much of an answer as I got, but he was already looking to start Amiga at that point while he was working on the pacemaker processor. And I looked at him in his cubicle drawing away, and his lap was entirely filled with electric eraser crumbs. And I said, "Jay, what are you doing?" And he looked at me and he says, "Well, don't you know how to design a chip yet? You cover the Mylar with ink, with the plastic lead, cover it, and then erase everything that's not a processor."
Nice. Right. It's like how you find the statue in the marble, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You just you have to let it out of the marble. So that's what he was doing.
Yes.
And as I said, I need to get back to the rest of my evening.
All right. I super appreciate your time. Last question then. If you could send a message to the Atari 8-bit users who are listening to this podcast, what would you tell them?
It was a different time, and I'm sorry about not getting the marketing piece right. There was so much we could have done given the hardware we had in front of us, but maybe next time.
All right. Thank you so much, Steve.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
If you enjoyed these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.